I'm Dr. Jim Daly from Daly Manufacturing. I'm here with our, uh, particularly the ones that will answer the phone when you people call in and talk to us. This is our monthly training for our employees and also for the general public. And we hope a lot of you will be looking at this and learning a little bit more about it. We will have a short period at the end for questions and answers. If we have questions among our people, they can certainly ask, and maybe we'll clarify some things that are not as clear to people. Also, comments from people. Also have a scientist, a plant chemist, a bioactive compound chemist, very good at what he does. He interacts with us quite a bit, actually, in product development and our main topic right now. There's a lot of interest in it lately. Just in the past week, there was a lawsuit in California. It was $85 million because Roundup may have contributed to his cancer. So a lot of the people who are another thing that's been of interest is lately working group, which is a pretty decent organization actually. They just released dirty food, plant foods, produce. It's listed about the same thing over the next year. And avoid harmful products, how to maintain a clean lifestyle. Going onto their website and looking at it, I think it's worthwhile. They would be happy to contribute money to their organization, and I actually completely though. I just want to mention a few studies recently. Just I thought might be of interest. This was the March 29 Science magazine, and it's got an article that I found pretty interesting, difficult reading honestly, but pretty interesting in that you'll see that potassium rejuvenates tumor-infiltrating immune cells. These are the T cells that are actually able to fight against cancer, and apparently to replicate well, deficient in the potassium. And they're suggesting that good potassium status will help you in a battle against cancer, your own immune system. And it looks pretty interesting, and when you see it in the journal Science, you really usually take notice. It's one of the two top scientific journals, it and Nature, in the entire world. So it's very hard to publish in, and you pay attention. And not often you see nutrition coming up in Science. It gets the very best thing from geography and geology to life science. Another study that came out that I found particularly interesting was a meta-analysis looking at the effect of peppermint oil, how it can alleviate irritable bowel syndrome. And I've kind of known about this for years, but it's been more of an anecdotal thing from what. However, there have been some studies. It is effective and safe for helping mitigate the symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. So that's something I would take notice of. We do not have peppermint oil right now. We might in the future. There's not many companies making peppermint oil capsules, but there are a few out there. And I think for that very narrow population with bowel syndrome, it may be something very good. One other study or article in the journal Neotropical Entomology is looking at the agriculture in Brazil and how it's trying to go more toward organic production. And I'll just read from this article for you. It was very recently published this year. Brazil is one of the main users of chemical pesticides in the world. These products threaten human and environmental health, and many of them are prohibited in countries other than Brazil. This paradigm exists in contrast with worldwide efforts to make the need for human protection compatible with biodiversity conservation, preservation of ecosystems, and human health. So you can see that if I were a farmer in Brazil, I would really hate to see that published, but it may not do much for their exports of agricultural products. That they are really wanting to improve on that. Now, the main point of the article is that the government's trying to fast track a lot of different, quote, organic pesticide type products management. Some of them are biological, some of them are natural chemicals, so to speak. But they're warning about doing that too, because fast tracking something like organic pesticides is not a great idea, because you really want to make sure you do it. And it could threaten their organic industry there if people get the idea that organic foods from Brazil are not as safe as organic foods from other countries. So that's something they need to consider. And that pretty cool. Both in the public arena and in the scientific arena, there's really a lot of interest in putting pesticides, chemicals, and eating a clean, safe diet. Foods, because it really is a valid. We would have to assume that not everything goes into food is harmful. I mean, the people aren't out there trying to poison each other. They have reasons for poisoning people. That occurs with foods. And this is a list of chemicals. It starts with a few down here on the bottom page, and it really is more categories of chemicals that go into foods than pesticides. Really, in fact, all of these are insecticides, not all agricultural chemicals. But we've got a whole page here, you can see, and a whole page on the next page of chemicals that go into foods. It's really hard to keep track of them all. That was one of the difficult things that I came across in doing this study. Lots of these chemicals out there, but trying to identify product. And when I'm trying to look up on PubMed to find the article, what chemicals would you normally have in strawberries, for instance? I really couldn't, to be honest, because there's so many to choose from, hundreds of them literally, that nobody can very easily. I can put a lot of studies on how to try in foods. I couldn't find many people using the methods and saying what they are. Puzzling and kind of frustrating. Understand it means that it must be bad. And a lot of that idea. If you don't know what it is, assume it's bad. Not exactly true, and it's not exactly to look into. So, if you don't know what it is, a major beneficial broccoli. So it's not something that you need to avoid, even though it has a very ominous sounding chemical name to me. I didn't know what it was. It doesn't have something of a name. And if you look over on the under the airplane there spraying the chemicals, you can guess which one's getting sprayed, can't you? It's not sulforaphane. It's a glyphosate. And I can't look, I'm a chemist, and I cannot look at those chemicals and there's nothing obvious about their chemical structures that would tell me that. I don't know, maybe Lang would know, but I can't. But I do know what they are because, they have been readily identified. So just because you look at something that has a chemical structure or a chemical name, it doesn't mean it's good or bad. It just means it might be there if it's on the list of ingredients. So that's why we need to kind of educate ourselves to know what is good and what is bad and why. Now let's get to the list that was given by the Environmental Working Group. The Dirty Dozen. Now, this isn't this year's list, and I'll go down. This year, but it gives you pictures of pretty much all the nice fruits and vegetables in both years. This year, strawberries topped the list. And they were second in the year that's here. But the strawberries are pesticide-heavy fruit, and they're not easily cleaned, just the nature of the outside of them. You don't have that slick finish that you have on some things that you can wash off easily. So they're a little bit more difficult to clean. Spinach came in second, and one of my very favorites, kale, came in third. And I'm a real kale eater. However, one thing I will say about kale, you can eat that in our area year-round. Kale is something that will last through the entire winter in your garden if you plant it. So that's one of the nice things about it. You don't have to go to the grocery store and buy it if you can plant a little bit of it. Nectarines, apples came next, were fifth on the list, but first that year. They do get sprayed a lot, apples do. And one of the really kind of insidious apples is in pear. Harder for you to clean any pesticides off of them. It's more difficult. So it takes a little bit more work to get the apples clean. This year grapes were number 6, peaches 7, cherries 8, pears 9, tomatoes number 10, celery 11, potatoes 12, and hot peppers sort of tied with them. They rounded the dirty 12 this year. Potatoes were last both years. I have a list of the 15 you have to worry about. On them, and it doesn't penetrate apparently. Sweet corn, which kind of surprised me. Pineapple, it probably doesn't get sprayed much. Cabbage actually makes a lot of sense for one reason. cabbage probably would get sprayed a lot, except that cabbage grows in the colder climates. You'll see if you go up right off the Blue Ridge Parkway, there's a big cabbage farm, and they've got nice big ripe cabbages ready to harvest right now, probably, or if they haven't already harvested them. So they've been up there pretty much all winter growing. So in the winter, you don't, or colder months, you don't need to spray pesticides on the cabbage. Sweet peas, they probably get shelled from that outer shell, so they're probably not exposed very much. Asparagus, some of the tropical fruits are pretty good because they've got skins, I suppose. Mangoes and papayas turned out to be pretty good, as did kiwi fruits, eggplant, grapefruits. Things that you normally peel are usually a lot safer or have a lot less pesticides. Cauliflower kind of surprised me, actually, because it has that exposed head when it's ripe. That one surprised me that it was there. And sweet potatoes, I wouldn't have thought were much different from regular potatoes. So some of those surprised me a little bit. But in general, a lot of these things are actually pretty good. Asparagus is good because it comes up about this time of year. So it gets harvested before the insects really come out in force. So, you know, a lot of these kind of factors make a big difference. But let's move on. Humans have always had to question if food is safe. Now, these mushrooms might be safe to eat. I don't know this particular variety. That's why I put it there. I can't tell you if they are or not. Some people can. I can tell you that if they were growing in this area, they're probably safe. Anybody know why? Well, they're growing on dead wood trees. In the eastern half of the United States, all of the mushrooms that grow on dead wood or on live trees are non-toxic. Now, they may taste bad, but they're not poisonous. However, if you go to the West Coast, there's some that are quite toxic that grow on trees, so you've got to know the difference. But generally, before you go eating mushrooms, you want to know if they're good or bad. I love to pick wild mushrooms on occasion. I only have a few that I trust myself enough to eat, however. But there are some that are quite good that are available here. And if you're a little farther north, there's more of what you call the morel mushrooms, which are just wonderful if you can find those wild. But there's many things to consider about safety. First of all, we all know the kind of the toxicology mantra that the dose makes the poison. So when we're talking about these environmental chemicals, are we really getting enough to be toxic? The answer could be yes, and I'll explain in a little bit why. But we don't know for sure always. Very many times we don't. The route of entry makes a big difference. You know, if you're talking about a substance, well, I'll give you an example that's not really food. China and Korea have this dust that blows off the Gobi Desert in China. And it can be kind of a real environmental hazard to people in those countries. Certain times of year when you get a lot of that dust blowing, it just fills the air. You'll see people walking around with masks on a lot. That dust, if it gets on food and you eat it, the dust itself, unless there's some kind of environmental chemical that's got contaminated with, that won't harm you. It's mostly silica, sand, very fine particles though, but if that goes into your lungs, it can really do a number on your lungs and cause silicosis, which can be quite serious and lead to cancer. So it depends on, it's not a typical toxin. It depends on where it goes, whether it's bad for you or not. Solubility, there again, the solubility, where it goes into the food, whether it's in the oils or whether it's in the water soluble parts of the plant or the product, can make a difference. For one thing, water soluble toxins go to the liver more directly. because of the way they're absorbed. So they hit the liver before they go to any of the rest of the body. That gives the liver a chance to detoxify those chemicals, to break them down, to make them into safer chemicals. Whereas oil-soluble chemicals are absorbed into the lymphatic system and are released in different parts of the body by that route. And they can be neurotoxic or other things a lot more readily than the water-soluble ones. You also consider it by whether or not it is actually in the food product, according to its solubility. And I'll give you an example. We used to sell lecithin here that ADM said was tested non-GMO. Okay, the problem with that was lecithin is oil soluble, and the nucleic acids, RNA, DNA, and the proteins that are genetically modified are water soluble. So there were none of those in any of the lecithin they tested that comes from soybeans, simply because it's not in that part of the fraction. They were being a little bit dishonest there, and they quit doing it after a while because they recognized that all the lecithin they tested turned out non-GMO. And, you know, since most of the soybeans are GMO in this country, it just wasn't, possible that was really non-GMO soybeans that they were selling the lecithin from. Now, one other thing, and I had to look at this recently, and we had a person talking to us about soy oil in a capsule. And I wasn't quite sure of the answer, so I just didn't go there because I didn't want to say something I didn't know was true. But glyphosate, the Roundup that the non-GMO soybeans have sprayed on them, is also oil soluble. And I did find confirmation in a paper that these oils have no glyphosate in them. So they not only have none of the genetically modified proteins and nucleic acids, they also have none of the glyphosate, the Roundup, in the soy oils. And that would be true of safflower oil if it's non-GMO, if it's GMO, or if canola oil, or any of the oils. They're not going to have it in there because it just, by the time they get through purifying the oils, there's none of it left. It's all been removed into water-soluble fractions. So that's something to consider. If you're really concerned about the glyphosate, you can feel safe eating products with soy oil in it. You can't feel safe eating soy milk. You can't feel safe eating tofu if it's not organic. So, and while we're talking about that, anything that's organic is by definition non-GMO, because GMO plants can't be used in organic, can't be certified organic. So you can, if that's something you're very concerned about, really try to go organic wherever possible. The second thing is, does the body have the capacity to deal with it? Many things it does, and that would depend a lot on the person. Some people are just extremely chemical sensitive, and other people are essentially not bothered by them. That can be for a couple of reasons. One, you can develop an immune intolerance to some chemicals, a chemical intolerance of some kind, or your liver may not be functioning up to par and you're not detoxifying those chemicals as well. So your body may or may not, and that'll be an individual question in that case. Also, how much is known about it? When we're looking at these chemicals, sometimes we know a lot about them, sometimes we don't. Finally, does it accumulate in the body? Most water-soluble things do not accumulate that much, just like water-soluble vitamins, whereas fat-soluble things can accumulate. And fat stores in the body can have quite a bit of the environmental fat-soluble toxins sometimes. I've always wondered, I've never found the paper on it. I've kind of looked for a paper on this. I wonder if with rapid weight loss, if people do release a lot of toxins into their body very quickly when they go on these, really quick fasts. And if that's a problem, I've never found a paper that says that. Have you ever seen anything, Shingman, on that? Not really. I haven't either. I'm not sure if anybody's really looked at that. But it is at least a theoretical possibility that rapid weight loss could do that. And that's the question that I've had. I don't know the answer to. I wish I did, actually. Moving on. So, PPPs. In case you don't know it, while I was doing this, I found what that is. One of the papers I was looking at identified plant protective products. Sounds great, doesn't it? It's pesticides. That's what they're calling plant protective. That's a euphemistic term to make it sound nice. So it can be your insecticides, it can be your fungicides, your herbicides, but plant protective products. This issue is addressed, though, if they're tested, why do we need to worry? If people tested, can we trust them to give us the right answers? Well, there's several problems with the tests they do on these things. And this is actually an open access publication. If somebody wants to go to toxicology reports and look up the role of toxic stimuli combinations in determining safe exposure limits, anyone can go on PubMed, kind of search for this paper and find it and print it. A lot of papers that's not true of. That if you don't have a subscription to the journal, they're going to charge you $40 to get the paper. That's in itself a controversial issue, but anyway, it's this one is open access, so if you're interested, you can go online and get this paper. There's two main types of studies that this paper identifies that are usually used in these toxicology studies for the environmental chemicals. One is human studies, which are usually epidemiological studies, and animal studies. The human epidemiological studies are more after-the-fact studies, looking to see if something that's been out there for a while is causing problems. So in this kind of study, they'll see people who are, according to their diet, they may know are exposed to a certain chemical, and whether or not that chemical puts them at an increased risk for some disease. There's not actually that many of those studies, apparently, but there's some of them out there. Animal studies are what most toxicology data is based on, but there's some limitations to them. First of all, animal studies are short. They study them just a single chemical, usually. So we're looking at, if you want to look at glyphosate or malathion or whatever, you would take that one chemical, you'd give the mice or rats a fairly high dose of it, much higher than a person would get because you're doing it in a shorter time span and you're wanting to mimic what many years of exposure to the chemical would be in a person. So you kind of make a rough assumption that a higher dose for a shorter period is equivalent to a lower dose for a longer period, which is, about the best you can do in some of these cases. So that in itself may be a limiting factor. They may not incorporate existing literature always. It's always out there. They're relying on their own studies. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, they don't really publish these studies. That's true of pharmaceuticals and chemicals like this. They just provide them to the people at the EPA or the FDA to read, and a lot of the pharmaceutical and environmental studies are never actually published for everybody to see. They're just used to get approvals. But the most important thing in the point of this article was they don't consider interactions or cumulative effects of multiple chemical exposures. Now, if we go back to the full Dirty Dozen list, Strawberries, the environmental working group identified 13 different pesticides in most strawberries, not just one. And what we don't know is the cumulative effect and additive effect and interactions of all these chemicals. And that is not normally studied according to this report in toxicology reports. So there's some things that we have to be concerned about because we don't know the impact. When we've got in just one food 13, and one of the other ones had 15 actually, you know, that many different pesticides in one food, and we eat dozens of food every week, you know, we are getting a potentially hundreds of different chemicals in our foods at very small levels that we really don't know how they interact. And so that's something that we've got to be concerned about. And I think that's a major contribution of this paper, is that it really does tell us that these interactions are important to look at. So, how can we avoid PPPs? And I decided to change the name of it. I call it people poisoning products. That's not what the first people had in mind. But first of all, we don't want to get too bent out of shape on this, in that we really restrict our diet so much that we don't get good nutrition. But eat organic foods when you can, especially those that are known to have the more higher levels or more different pesticides. That's always going to be, you know, safe. You'll read reports of them finding chemicals and pesticides in organic foods, and if you think about it, there's a good reason for that. You notice that plane flying over, a gust of wind can carry those pesticides for miles sometimes, and they can go over to the organic gardeners or farmers' fields too that are not too far away. So you do find it, but when they've done studies on it, usually almost 1,000-fold less in organic foods if they're there, and oftentimes they're not there at all. So if you had, say, 10 parts per million of a particular pesticide in broccoli from a commercial farmer, 10 parts per million, you'd probably have 10 parts per billion over here at the organic farm. So even though they say, oh, well, you can't trust organic stuff, they still have it in it. Really, when it gets right down to it, real life, it's way less in it. But there are traces of it. The glyphosate, I'm still not sure how dangerous that is in my own mind, honestly, but it's showing up everywhere. It's showing up in groundwater, it's showing up in fish, it's showing up in beef, you know, small traces of it, but it's there. You know, it's pretty pervasive, and, you know, organic farmers have to water their crops like everybody else. So there's going to be trace amounts, and the people like Sheeman Singh can find such small amounts of stuff, it's incredible. So it's you know, the amount that you can detect is just unbelievably small. Grow your own foods and eat locally grown foods as much as you can. When you grow your own foods, you know you didn't put it on there for sure. Hopefully, unless you did. Eat locally grown foods from people you trust. You can at least ask them, well, what pesticides do you use, or do you use them? And hopefully they'll give you an honest answer. You can wash your foods. Carefully washing foods is really a pretty good idea, because you can get a lot of that off. This particular paper here, no, this one. This paper actually tested the ability of different very common household chemicals for removing pesticides. Solutions of 20% acetic acid or citric acid could actually get about 70% of everything off of it pretty quickly and easily. They also used some herbs to do it with. They used ginger extract, they used lemon extract, garlic extract to do it. And actually the ginger extract, all those herb extracts got about 50% in solution off as they set it up. So not quite as effective as the acids. However, the ginger, interestingly enough, had one other effect. It actually degraded one of the pesticides. Didn't just remove it, wash it away, but degraded it. So that was kind of an interesting effect. Yeah, and radish extract. So these are things, if you really want to really get something well cleaned, use the soap and water, because that'll get some of that oily stuff off, help with warm water to get the paraffin off the apples. Do an acid wash and then an alkaline wash, because they probably get a little bit different things better. Read labels, look up ingredients that you don't recognize. Kind of extra, you know, it's not just pesticides in food that we need to be concerned about. It's also just the things people add to food sometimes. And you want to know what it is and whether or not it's safe. Understand that you will not be able to avoid toxic exposure completely. You just can't do it in this world. But, you know, don't become so fanatical unless you have really severe sensitivities that you eat poorly because you cannot do it perfectly. And there are people like that. And you don't want to limit your diet and get poor nutrition because you're afraid of the chemicals. You're shooting yourself in the foot to do that. Limit your own use of toxic substances. And, you know, when you're talking about something like Roundup, I can assure you that if you're out not taking precautions, spraying your driveway and yard with Roundup and getting it spilled on you and spraying it on you and inhaling it and stuff like that, you're not really careful with it, you're going to get more in one day of doing that you can probably get in a lifetime of eating foods with trace amounts of it. So, you know, keep that in mind, your own use of these chemicals. And then maintain a healthy liver. And we talked about the liver, 2 months ago? We have a product, Livivite, that can really help you maintain a healthy liver. However, it does degrade the toxins. And people with a healthy liver are much less sensitive to these toxins, from best we can tell, than other people who are not. And I do know people who are just unbelievably sensitive to toxins. So you have to really look at the individual person and their exposure. And that's what I have for today. You're always ahead of the game to, you know, try to maintain a clean, chemical-free diet as much as you can, and to maintain a overall level of health so you can deal with the challenges. And one other thing I'll kind of throw out, there was a book written by a Russian chemical warfare person that I have. And he pointed out that in chemical warfare, a lot of times they'll kill, you know, large percentages of a population when they've used it. However, not everyone dies. And some people have a better tolerance to those chemicals even than other people. And we're talking about some nasty stuff that they use for chemical warfare. So maintaining a good liver, a good overall health, a good immune system is going to get you by with a lot of exposure to toxins that probably a lot of the other people can't. And he pointed out that our best defense against toxins is to have a healthy body that can deal with them. So, and I thought that was pretty profound coming from a chemical warfare person. Well, thanks a lot. Do we have questions among our group here or anyone else?
Yes.
Okay, questions are coming.
Okay, first, as far as washing fruits and vegetables, how effective are vinegar and hydrogen peroxide in getting pesticides on that?
The hydrogen peroxide, I'm not quite sure. Vinegar was pretty good, but it was a pretty potent vinegar. It was a 20% vinegar that was the highest, 20% acetic acid. I'm not sure you can get that easily. I think most of your commercial vinegars are quite a bit lower than that, are they not? Does anybody know offhand? Huh?
They have a stronger one now.
Do they? Okay. But that was the one that did the best. And a citric acid solution that you can make on your own also is pretty good. So, yeah, a little bit less effective was they used sodium chloride and sodium bicarbonate. There again at 20% solutions. And they were not quite as good as the acid solutions, but they were pretty good. But I suspect that they worked on different pesticides and chemicals more effectively. And if you actually did one and the other, you'd probably be best off. I'd do the alkaline first and the acid followed up if I really was wanting to get it. The hydrogen peroxide, I don't know. That wasn't in the study. I'm not quite sure. Hydrogen peroxide can degrade a lot of things, so it might be beneficial. Other questions? Okay, I think that's it. Well, everybody, I hope this was helpful to you, good information, and I hope you have a wonderful evening if it's evening where you are, or morning if you're on the other side of the world. Thank you very much. Goodbye.